Hello and welcome back to the Napoleonic Wars podcast. And ding ding, it's time for round two. Just a few weeks ago, I dropped a brilliant, well, what was meant to be one episode on the army of the Duchy of Warsaw, not the Grand Duchy. We covered that last time. And what we found was that we got through about 4 or 5 questions in the space of an hour and 15 minutes. And it was very obvious to me that we either needed to do a shoddy job of finishing off that interview or pause, break, come back, and do the second half properly. And this being the Napoleonic Wars podcast, we like to do things properly and go to town. So we are back for another installment with the brilliant Dawid Gralik. David,
Hello.
hello. David is a PhD student at the Department of History at the Adam Mickiewicz University. Did I get it right that time?
Mm,
Not really, I think, is what
good,
he's
good,
kind
good.
of politely
You,
saying
you,
there.
you could do this better.
Um, he's based in Poznan. His research interests are focused on the military history of the Napoleonic Wars, particularly the Polish art of war during the period and social aspects of the Polish troops. He'll probably be coming back to do some stuff on Polish troops directly within the French army. We'll have a discussion after this about quite how we make that, but let's be honest, it's got to be done, right? But he's currently very, very busy preparing a dissertation on the officer corps of the Duchy of Warsaw Army, and he was awarded a scholarship for that work from the Fondation Napoleon in 2021. David, great to see you back. How are you doing?
I'm fine, thank you. Thanks for having me again.
Oh, absolute pleasure. There was no way I was going to do a kind of quick wrap up when we had so much more still to talk about. I might even use this as an excuse to squeeze some crime and punishment nerdery along the way. But let's move quickly on from that idea. Well, we're going to dive straight back in, I think, and just talk about service record for the Duchy of Warsaw Army. Folks, if you haven't listened to part one, my recommendation would be that you hit pause, go back to listen to part one, and then come back to this one because this is the continuation. So we're going to talk about the service record of the army. Where does it go? I guess is the obvious question. What does it end up doing? And how well does it do? If that's not a rude question to ask.
Yeah, so in general, I think it's a topic for a book, for a very big book.
If only we knew somebody who could write such a book.
Yeah, but I'll try to present it quite briefly. So let's start from 1807 because it's thing that the Polish army started to fight quite quickly since this army had been formed in autumn and winter from 1806 to 1807. And the first major battle was capturing of Detchev in February 1807. Conquering of the city was very important because it was necessary to uh, have an offensive to Gdańsk, which of course which was a very important city, very important fortress at that time for Napoleon because of from the strategic reasons, covering the flanks and so on. And of course, was captured Tczew, and then they participated in a few sieges like Kołobrzeg, like Grudziądz or Gaudenz, Kołobrzeg or Kolberg at that time because there were Prussian cities, of course, that time, and of course Gdańsk or Danzig. And finally, they participated in the Battle of Friedland, which have, I think, quite important role. And then we are going to 1808, and here started a Spanish episode because our listeners can know that there were Polish troops from the French army in Spain, like Chevaulegers Regiment or Vistula Legion, but also the Dutch Warsaw Army was also participating in this war. So in this 1808 was formed so-called Polish division, and later it was recalled to renamed to Duchy of Warsaw division because of some political reasons, because Napoleon didn't want to make Russians angry, and so he decided to change this name. And a little about the circumstances of this formation, because it's quite interesting. And it was formed as a result of Duchy's financial problems. Napoleon decided to take 3 infantry regiments, which were decided to send to Spain. And initially, Poniatowski proposed to form new regiments from soldiers selected from all regiments to be commanded by surplus officers. But Davout, who was commander-in-chief of the Duchess army at that time, didn't agree. He took it upon himself to select the 3, in his opinion, the best infantry regiments. And the criterion taken into account was the respective backgrounds of their commanders, and so of the 3 colonels, as many as 2, Sukovsky and Potocki, came from the aristocracy. And in the end, 1 regiment was chosen from each division. It was 4th, 7th, and 9th Infantry Regiment, and it took part in several battles, for example, at Almanas, Ciudad Real, Almonacid, or Ocaña. And in my opinion, the greatest success, because I think in general Polish troops were very successful during the Peninsula War, but the greatest success, in my opinion, was the defense of Von Hirola Castle in October 1810. And maybe I will surprise you, but it was battle against the British forces, and it was a quite Polish situation when we've got enemy who had 1,000, about 2,000 troops, and there was 400 Poles. So we are a little bit outnumbered in that battle. And the commander of the Polish forces was Captain Franciszek Mokosiewicz from the 4th Infantry Regiment, and commander of the British was Lord Blaney. And as I thought, he had about 2,000 men. So the success of the Poles was so great that General Sebastiani, commanding the corps, which included the Polish division, didn't want to believe the reports sent after the battle. Only when he himself went to the battlefield did he believe in the scale of the Polish success. Interestingly, Lord Blaney, after he was released because he was captured during that battle, he published his memoirs in 1814, when he described not only his defeat but also the terrible despise he had suffered from the Poles. But the thing is that it's not true. And in fact, that's why Mokosiewicz wrote his own memoirs, because he knew Blaney's memoirs, because they were published also in French. And of course, Mokosiewicz knew French. And so he described the situation from his perspective. And he wrote that these British memoirs are not very good. The funny fact is that Mokosiewicz wrote that Blaney, who was POW in Verdun in 1812, he wanted to meet with Mokosiewicz. So that's the reason. But I think that this British memoirs are not so very good to present this battle. But unfortunately, this Mokosiewicz memoirs are not available in foreign language, I think. So it's a little bit difficult, but to know it, but they are quite interesting, I think. And returning to the main theater in Poland, the next conflict was the war against Austria in 1809. And this war, of course, is better known for its actions in Germany and Austria, with battles of Aspern and Wagram at the forefront. But hostilities also took place in the Duchy of Warsaw. And very interesting, in fact, is the reason why Austrians wanted to attack Duchy, because they wanted to conquer it and give it back to Prussia as a, let's call it, prize for joining there to war, because situation in Prussia was unstable, in fact. Famous shields, partisans, and stuff like that. And Austrians thought that returning the duchy to Prussians will be good reason to fight with Austria against Napoleon. And that's why commander of the Austrian corps was Archduke Ferdinand d'Este, member of the imperial family, because he had also he could also negotiate with the Prussians, right? Because he was from the royal family, and his position was quite good. And before the war, there was several problems on the Polish side. First of all, the Polish army was fragmented. Some regiments were, of course, in Spain, as I told you, and some regiments were as garrisons in fortresses like Gdańsk. So Austrian superiority was 2-1. Of course, very poor situation once again. And Poles couldn't have any support, on the exception were some Saxon units, but it came back to Saxony after the first battle. And the Polish command decided to give the Austrians the Battle of Raschen, which took place on 19th of April. On the tactical scale, it was unconclusive, I think, but on the strategic scale, it was altogether a Pyrrhic victory for the Austrians, who forced the Poles to retreat to Warsaw. And Poles decided not to defend Warsaw, which was actually a very wise decision, as it opened up to possibility of an offensive into Galicia, the part of Poland that was occupied by the Austrians since the partitions. And they could do it because there were only a few bridges on the Vistula River in that time, and Austrians had to split their forces into a few directions. They wanted to cross Vistula and fight with Poles' main forces, and at the same time, they wanted to capture fortresses of Toruń to have an offensive on the Prussian to the Prussian region and Częstochowa, but they didn't capture any of these cities. Poles became to have an advantage because Poles in Galicia quickly organized their own units, and on Duchy territory were organized new regiments quite quickly, because, for example, of Dąbrowski's skills in organization of troops. And Poles won also a few minor battles and started to march on Krakow. And there is a very interesting case because not so many people know that in this war Russia was an ally of Napoleon. So the Russians joined the war. In theory, they should support Poles, but in fact, they made a sabotage of Polish actions. They had a secret agreement with Austrians to interfere Polish army. Austrians even asked Russia to enter Krakow before Poles, and they actually did it. But Prince Poniatowski, in fact, forced an entrance of the Polish army to the city. And the Treaty of Schönbrunn, which ended this war, gave the duchy a part of Galicia. And this was, of course, because of some political reasons, because Poles want to all Galicia to be conquered, but of course Napoleon didn't want to make the duchy too strong because he didn't want to make Russia angry once again. And the biggest number with participation of the Duchy of Warsaw army was, of course, the Russian campaign of 1812. But before describe it, let's say a few words about numbers. Due to the constitution of the Duchy, army should have 30,000 men. After the War of 1809, it was doubled to 60,000. And before War of 1812, another extra units were organized. Government of the Duchy in November 1812 prepared a report according to which the Duchy fielded 75,000 men and 20,000 horses for the war with Russia, which was, I think, the biggest contingent after French themselves. And during the war, we organized another units in the Duchy itself and in Lithuania, but Lithuanian forces didn't. They weren't subordinate to the Duchy's government, although they had successive regimental numbers of the Duchy's army, so the situation was quite weird. And after this long entry, I need to say that in fact Polish forces fought on every theater of this campaign, because that we've got this theater, Maciek on Moscow, and so on, but also we've got some another theaters like today's Latvia territory and Belarus. So both were in fact everywhere. And the next thing is that the Polish forces were also divided. So we've got this main forces in Fifth Corps of the Grand Army, commanded by Poniatowski himself. But there was also a few another units. We've got division in McDonald's Corps, which fought in Latvia, as I thought. And there was also a division in Victor's Ninth Corps, which was marching from Spain. So they marched across all Europe, in fact, from South Spain to Smolensk. It's a few thousand kilometers. So it's really, really, really impressive to have this all way to the Smolensk. And of course, they need to came back to Duchy because of the situation during that war. And we've got also some a cavalry division in the 4th Cavalry Corps, commanded by General Różniecki, and some particular Polish cavalry regiments in different French corpses. And let's start with 5th Corps. It found itself on the right wing of the main force, commanded by King Jerome Bonaparte. From the start, the actions didn't go well, as Jerome didn't command well, of course, because I don't know why Napoleon gave him this commandship. It's
I
a
mean, he
weird
didn't
situation.
command well because, let's face it, he's Jerome.
Yeah,
There's your answer right there.
I'm just wondering what was the reason of this decision to give him this commandship, because Jerome didn't have big experience. He wasn't talented like, I don't know, like Lucien or Joseph. So it's just quite a weird decision. But anyway, of course, this bad commandship of Jerome, of course, was one of the reasons why all Napoleon's plan failed. In fact, because he wanted to have this one major battle, and of course win it and start negotiations. But of course, we know that situation was quite different. The Russians retreated, and the first major battle was in fact the Battle of Smolensk in August 1812. Of course, Finkov participated, of course, in that battle, and later, of course, also in the Battle of Borodino. And the Polish Fifth Corps was on the right flank of the Napoleonic forces. And in fact, their situation during that battle was quite hard because the terrain was tough to fight on, because there were some forests in that area, some high grounds from the Russian side, and capturing this area was quite difficult to make. So I'm just quite surprised when some people say that Napoleon could have his main maneuver through right flank during that battle. For me, it's not a good thesis, but of course, I think that Poniatowski could have some reinforcements because his corps that time wasn't so strong, because he lost most of his men, in fact, because he started with 30,000, like I said. But during the Battle of Borodino, he had some about 10,000 men because of some marching clauses, of course, because of some minor fights. And also one of the divisions was sent to Belarus. It was Dąbrowski's division, which was, in fact, in the later part of the campaign, quite important for the result. And of course, after the Borodino post-march on Moscow, in fact, one of the Polish regiments, the 10th Hussar Regiment, was the first Napoleonic regiment who entered Moscow. In fact, it's a quite interesting thing. And of course, we've got these fights after capturing Moscow. We've got some minor fights, which one of my favorite, Battle of Chirikovo, which is very less known battle, but it's very interesting. When Poles again won when they were outnumbered. 3-1, if I remember. And we've got staying of the both sides. You've got this, of all of this Tartino camp on the Russian side, and of course Russian offensive, the Battle of Tarutino, when in fact Poles had a major role in this battle because in fact they, let's say, that just had a big role in saving Murat's forces in that battle. But of course, casualties were also hard in that battle. For example, died chief of the general staff, General Fischer, in that battle. And of course, we've got this fights during the retreat. And now let's say a few words about Dombrowski, because his division stayed on the Belarus, and he needed to cover lines of supplies of the main forces, and also Napoleon wanted him to capture some fortresses in that area, but he couldn't do it because his forces weren't very strong. And in fact, the main problem was that the Russians started their offensive because there was Chagov's army, which came from war against Turkey, which ended few months before, and the main task for Dobrowski was covering area of the Borisov. It was a small town, and the thing is that they were located very important bridge on the Berezina River, because Napoleon wanted to cross Berezina in that area, but Dombrowski didn't defend this area. He made a few mistakes, in my opinion, during the campaign, and of course, very outnumbered. So they didn't hold their positions, and that's why we've got Battle of the Berezina River, in fact, because the bridge was lost, and Napoleon had to find another place to cross Berezina River. And we've got this battle, which was again had a major role, I think. They fought very well, and in fact, they just retreated to the Duchy, and we've got this whole reorganization in the beginning of the 1813, and again they moved to Germany because Poniatowski didn't want to fight when he was in fact on a big distance from the main forces, especially that he thought that Austria could be on the side of the anti-Napoleon coalition, and he was right. So it was a very good decision, I think, to retreat to Germany, and of course Poles participated in this campaign. Again, I think that they fought very well, because this campaign was very characteristic, because it was more minor fights than big battles, and it was very, I think, comfortable, but but it was better situation at 1812, because this Russian campaign was very hard for the Poles. I think they weren't fully prepared for the situation. I think that nobody was prepared on the Napoleonic side, in fact, during the campaign, and so they just were in better situation, in fact, and they fought really well. And of course, we got this main battle of Leipzig, right, in October 1813, and the Poles, of course, fought in that battle. They fought again really well, and in the last day they covered the retreat of the French troops, and we've got all this bridge situation, and that's why Poniatowski died, in fact, because French blown up bridge too fast, and Poles couldn't make their retreat. So in fact the casualties was very hard during that battle. So when some Polish troops were reorganized in 1814 in France, it was only one infantry regiment and two cavalry regiments, in fact, and they also fought in that campaign, and they fought very well. like in defense of Soissons, or battle like, I don't know, Assisi Op, or Berry-au-Bac. It was very interesting charge through the bridge made by Polish lancers. And I think that's it. We've got this whole Fontainebleau Treaty, and both came back to Poland.
It just reinforces what I was discussing with Rachel, doesn't it? Talk about a plucky underdog fighting well, pretty consistently, and yet against a series of odds that just are not in their favor, really, at any point. And sadly, that sort of feels very much like a microcosm of a lot of Polish history. Plucky people who have
We don't like when it's easy.
no, really, you sort of start to wonder if you guys had it easy, would you have been happy with that? I'm not entirely sure. The consistency with which you just face these ridiculous odds and do your darndest is remarkable. I want to talk about morale and cohesion, particularly in a situation like this where it's difficult, right? Because in the one sense, perhaps you sign up because of a devotion to the cause. But if you end up in the deepest depths of the Russian campaign and it's minus whatever it is, something like minus 20 points, this idea that you're fighting for your homeland, as I've discussed on other occasions with the likes of Ed Koss, it's not what keeps you going. It's just not. There are other things that keep you motivated on campaign, and usually that's the people who are fighting to the left and the right of you. But they're taking horrific losses. And in a situation like that, it's very hard to maintain those bonds. So how does how do Polish troops manage to kind of keep themselves motivated and keep morale up and stay cohesive in these campaigns?
In fact, I think that there was some problems with cohesion in the early period due to this conflict between Kwiatkowski, Zajączek, and Dąbrowski, which I described in our previous episode. In fact, in these early years, each region was autonomous, and existing that state was in fact political decision than practical one, because not everyone know that first commander-in-chief of the Duchy of Warsaw army was Marshal Davout, and he didn't take any wise side in that conflict. So finally, of course, he decided to choose Poniatowski, and he made him, in fact, commander-in-chief. And Poniatowski started to make things on his own because he wanted to make this unification of the army. In fact, he started it even before. If we see his decisions, like sending troops outside of the duchy, we think we can see that most of these regiments which were sent, it was regiments from another divisions that Poniatowski's division. So even Dąbrowski took his leave for a moment because in fact, his division was very small. He had something like, I don't know, 3 regiments under his command for a while. So he just decided to take his lead because he had also new wife, so he wanted to have some peace because he hadn't until many years. And anyway, of course, there was this another problem with this splitting of the forces, of course, because this regiments in garrisons, we've got this regiments in Spain, in fact, and all this bureaucracy thing, because these forces were paid by French, for example, in Spain, but of course, all nominations came through the duchy, and it was it just made many problems it was so hard to administrate all this thing. In fact, and in general, I think that about main forces which were in Duchy since this unification in 1809 and abolition of the legions, I think there was no cohesion problems until the up, until after the Battle of Leipzig situation. And as far as morale is concerned from the beginning, um, I think it was quite high because both realized what was at stake, namely the restoration of independence, and it was this thing which was main thing for the post that we are fighting for our country because our situation is not stable. We need to fight. We need to do the best we can, and it was this thing which was the main factor, I think, for Poles. And the best example is the Russian campaign, especially during the retreat, when the Polish Fifth Corps was the only one to maintain cohesion until the end, as evidenced by the fact that it retained all its cannons and almost all its banners, which gave the Polish soldiers a very good testimony, I think. There is a touching scene, by the way, um, when the remnants of the corps arrived in Warsaw at the end of December 1812 and went to the Podblachon Palace, which was Poniatowski's headquarters. Poniatowski, despite being in poor shape, as he had felt off his horse in early November and returned to the duchy early, had himself carried into the courtyard, and on seeing his men, he ordered refreshments to be arranged for them as soon as possible. Because they came to him, they showed him this banners, and it was touching scene. And of course, there were moments of crisis. There were, of course, situations like after the Battle of Russian in 1809. Despite the good attitude of the soldiers and the fact that the battle was in fact inconclusive, this subsequent retreat and especially the surrender of Warsaw without a fight certainly had a negative effect on morale, but the offensive in Galicia and the subsequent successes quickly rebuilt morale. An even greater slump occurred after the Battle of Leipzig, and as it was released that the Polish cause was rather lost, but here too the situation was stabilized. And of course, a separate matter concerns the post-fatigue in Spain, as a very sad picture emerged from the surviving letters. The fighting of the Dutch troops in Spain caused a whole host of problems, which are thought about. One of them was, of course, communication problem, not only with the Spanish, but even with the French. The funny thing is that one Polish major complained in a letter to General Fischer that only 3 people, including himself knew French, which put a lot of work on these 3 officers. Added to this was the issue of promotions, as appointed arrived with a strong delay. And besides, Poniatowski had a habit of sending officers from the duchy and not promoting them within the regiments fighting in Spain. All of this caused a sense of injustice and abandonment in these troops. Of course, the soldiers were also affected by the brutal nature of this war. Added to this were problems with supplies or a climate that caused illness. For this reason, many officers resigned, in fact, from this so-called Spanish regiments.
There is so much to take in from all of this. And I'm going to make it even worse by asking that question that I always ask people when it comes to armies during this period. Yes, you can moan and groan if you really want to, but you know what's coming. Discipline. How does it work in this force? I fully appreciate as I ask this that, record's going to be a problem here. But based on what we do know, how well behaved are these guys and how are they punished?
Firstly, I need to say that I respected then that you will want to discuss this issue. And in the case of the
I
Polish
mean, I am
army,
predictable, right? So,
in some parts you are, yeah. And I think that's a very interesting issue. However, of course, we've got this problem with sources, of course, but I will try to describe situation as widely as possible. I think that the biggest problems were in the early period, 1806-7, so when the army was just being formed. Because of supply problems, there were also problems in buying enough uniforms, and there were desertions, which they tried to combat as far as possible. And another thing was some legal problems because there was no um, military code in that time. So Dobrowski just decided to make a situation quite simple, that we've got this court martial and you are innocent, or you've got death sentence, in fact. Um, and we know that there were few death sentences in Dobrowski's forces, but not because of desertion, I think, but because of some, I think, crimes, and also to some coldness on the battlefield, because we also have a few examples of it. And another issue was the behavior of the army towards civilians, which was also a problem in some way. This was particularly the case with the so-called Pospolite Ruszenie. I can't find a proper English name for this formation, but this was a cavalry formation made up of noblemen and their servants, which was a continuation of traditions dating back to the medieval ages, and in Poland it existed to the 17th century. I think, by the way, it's interesting that this formation was created on Napoleon's request. It's a funny thing that Napoleon himself knew quite little about Poland. He knew, of course, he knew Poles from his Italian days, but he had quite little idea about Poland as a country. And his main source of information was a work by Claude Lerière, History of the Anarchy in Poland. And it's such a coincidence that he knew this work because it was only a manuscript at that time, because work itself hadn't been released yet. And it was because of Lerière's brother, which was a French officer probably, which just gave Napoleon this manuscript. But anyway, when Napoleon met Dąbrowski and Wybicki in autumn 1806, he just one of the things he said was, give me Pospolita." And Dąbrowski wasn't very happy because of it, because I think he knew that there will be problems with it, and in fact he was right. In these formations were big problems with discipline, because of course this was units created by noblemen, and they just thought that they could do more than simply soldiers, right? So discipline was quite low. So these units were quite quickly disbanded, and this people from that formations, in fact, wasn't very happy either. But I think that they just came home mostly, and some of them just came to regular forces. And another issue is that, taking advantage of the chaos of war, several autonomous units were formed, which remained de facto outside the control of the military authorities. An interesting example of this is the regiment of Prince Jan Sołkowski. Sołkowski was an Austrian subject, but on hearing that the French had entered Poland lands, he offered to organize a hussar regiment. Nominally, it was to be part of the French army, but Sołkowski sought to make it part of the Polish army. The regiment did fight against the Prussians and in Silesia region, but with poor results. It was far more famous for robbery and annoying the local population. In fact, In order to erase the bad impression, Sokolsky went as far as provocation, and hear it. He dressed part of his unit in Prussian uniforms and fought a sham skirmish with it. Yeah.
But what? That's one of the most ludicrous things I've heard on this show.
And
Hey,
listen this, because the real Prussian forces were nearby, and after the skirmish they attacked.
I mean, there are dumb ideas in history, and then there's that. That that just doesn't. Well, it's just. Oh, I'm genuinely I'm lost for words. I'm almost thinking I need to reshoot my reaction to that because I'm just here sort of gibbering like an idiot. I can't. I'm baffled. Let us move on.
Yeah, the interesting thing is that we've got two Princess Sukowski in that period, which were quite famous, which was Jan Sukowski and Antoni Paweł Sukowski, and this second guy, which was a general in the Polish army in some time. He wrote in one of his letters that, in fact, Jan Sukowski is an Indian, and we don't want to have any things with him, and don't write to him, don't talk to him, don't do anything, please, because he's an idiot.
we might have found somebody who was dumber than Murat, uh, as the
Yeah,
running joke goes on this podcast.
yeah. The thing is that Sokolsky was to be tried for his actions, but eventually he managed to get away. And the more funny thing is that later he was connected with French intelligence, and he spent a few years in Austrian prison. So
Right. Okay. You
and
kind of
funny thing
want.
is that he wasn't the only guy which made actions like this, because we've got, for example, guy called Albin Lenartovich. We know very little about his background, but in autumn 1806 he offered to organize a unit. Sometimes it was called brigade, but he had few hundred men max. In fact, more fighting, he was interested in sowing unrest. He even disregarded correspondence from military authorities. Like Potocki wrote to him a letter, "Man, we want you to disband your troops," but he thought, I don't care, some guy, so Potocki guy, who is he, right? But in the end, he in fact he disbanded his unit because they wanted him to be you know condemned, and to have a court martial. And
What an absolute nutter. I kind of feel that we might perhaps need to do an episode of, biggest loon of the Napoleonic Wars. And I think we might have found a strong contender for somebody who's properly nuts. Let's talk
yeah,
about the occupation of the duchy from 1813. Do you see a spate of desertions in the wake of that, or does that just motivate the troops to fight harder in that sense? Because there are two ways of looking at this, right? With the duchy occupied, it's fairly obvious that things are not going well, and that isn't a great motivator. And so that inclination to go home arguably goes up. Equally, with the duchy occupied, the only real prospect of solving that situation and safeguarding the future of the duchy is, of course, for Napoleon to win, which is an even stronger motivator to stay. So, which one ends up winning out?
I think we should separate this into two main periods. The first was the first half of the year, in which the Duchy's army withdrew to Krakow, leaving most of the country in the hands of the coalition. And during this period, a noteworthy phenomenon was the resignation of some of the senior officers. especially those who had their estates in Russia, because Tsar Alexander issued a decree giving amnesty in exchange for return to Russia, and several senior officers took advantage of this opportunity, such as Prince Konstanty Czartoryski and Prince Stachy Sambushko. The resignation of General Karol Kniaziewicz, an officer affiliated with the legions in the past, was particularly distressing, I think. Nevertheless, this conduct was generally condemned by the army. Unlike the civilian authorities, the army was overwhelmingly in favor of Napoleon, in fact. By the way, this was a phenomenon that, in fact, in 1813 and in 1809, the army was a mainstay of statehood, in fact, as civilians showed no willingness to fight, as evidenced by the 1812-1813 negotiations with the Russians, which was made by the Dutch government. This is, by the way, a very interesting issue. I think the greatest crisis was during the march from Krakow to Saxony in the summer of 1813, when desertion emerged, but it was countered quite severely. One diarist recalled that after the execution of several deserters, cases of desertion from the army ceased, in fact. Already during the campaign itself, the Polish army maintained cohesion until the Battle of Leipzig, in fact. The morale, as I told you, was quite high, I think. And after this battle, discipline collapsed, especially with the death of Prince Poniatowski. And there was a case of desertions, even among officers. Among them, for example, was Lieutenant Colonel Kurciusz, commander of a Polish battalion of the Imperial Guard, as Napoleon had formed a Polish infantry battalion as part of his guard in 1813. The second issue was the struggle for the position of commander-in-chief. Nominally, it should have been Dąbrowski, but he was absent from the Polish main forces because his division fought separately during the Battle of Leipzig. And the second in charge was General Sokolnitsky, but he wasn't very popular because at first the ranks thought that he was too much pro-French, which, by the way, proves that they didn't support Napoleon unconditionally. And eventually, as a result of intrigue by a group of generals, Prince Sulkowski became commander-in-chief, which was a culmination of a career for him, even though he was only 28 at the time. He managed to reassure the army with a promise that the Polish troops would escort Napoleon to the Rhine, after which they would return to Poland. The situation changed dramatically because Napoleon did his thing and then he convinced Poland to stay with him. I think we will talk about it a little bit later. And Poland just stayed with Napoleon to the end, right?
Yeah, we will pick that up in just a minute. That whole point about loyalty to Napoleon, because we were talking about that off air, and what you said really surprised and interested me. But before we do that, I just want to talk about reputation by the end of the war. I've talked a lot about sort of plucky underdog. I mean, there are two ways of looking at this, right? One is that, you know, you face these troops and they've got staying power against surprising odds. And the other is, well, sure, they've got staying power, but because they're overwhelmed by sheer weight of numbers, you can still win against them. How are they regarded both within the French sphere of influence, but also within the coalition sphere of influence?
I think the Polish army retained a high combat value until the very end of the Napoleonic period, as shown by actions. For example, we've got the scene from the French campaign from the Battle of Arcis-sur-Aube, when Napoleon himself took refuge for a time in the square formed of the Polish infantry during this battle. And of course, I think that the reputation was quite high. I think you've got this whole reputation of the Polish forces in Spain. Of course, it's mostly connected with the Polish forces in the French army, like Vistula Legion and Chevaulegers, but I think it's also some way connected with the Duchess regiments. I think, for example, if we see opinion of the French commanders about Polish units, I think that they are very good. And from the coalition side, I think it's the same. If we analyze, I don't know, memoirs of people who fought against Poles, for example, I don't know, in the Battle of Leipzig, for example, I think most of them wrote that Poles fought quite hard, and they was really hard opponent to beat, in fact. And of course, that's why you've got this whole political situation after first abdication of Napoleon, when Tsar Alexander wanted to be this guy who will be this um, I don't know how to describe it. This guy who is promoter of the Polish cause from that period, because Napoleon is gone, and there is there's a position for him to take, and it not only because Tsar wanted to rule over Poland, but also because of the Polish army, because he knew that that both were good soldiers, and it's a very good thing to have, this Polish army. And we also know that the political situation after the first abdication was quite hard. We got this whole negotiation in Vienna. That was very close to war, right? Between Russia and Prussia, and one of the reasons, of course, was situation of the duchy and its future. So the Polish army was really good card to have for Alexander.
I also want to ask briefly about the occupation of the duchy and how are civilians treated by coalition forces?
I think it's quite. I think they wanted to be quite. I don't know how to describe it. Quite polite for the civilians. Alexander himself ordered Russians to treat civilians good, because he wanted it to be also a card in negotiations that see let's see it. My troops are doing well. Of course, there was some problems because of the actions of the particular Russian soldiers or officers. There was also a problem that there was, in fact, a chaos in the Dutch at that time. We got this problem of, I don't know, deserters, marauders, and these all people which was walking in both directions, and the situation was quite hard. And another thing was a problem with authorities, because most of the Polish authorities left with the troops, and there was problem with administration. And in some periods, there was a temporary government made by the Russians with the Russian president, but there was some posts in that government, and they just want to have administrative control of the territory. They could the best they could, in fact. But it was a few problems, of course, this chaos, some legal issues, which we can see, in fact, if we analyze uh, how courts worked, because courts didn't want to make their job, because this occupation situation, we've got no orders, we have our own law, and we need to wait for the decisions of our duke, but he isn't able to give us these orders, and so on. It was very it was very difficult situation.
To give you an idea, that's not unique. So when Wellington goes into southern France in 1813-14, at the tail end of the Peninsular War, there are some brilliant accounts and letters within the Wellington papers in Southampton University Archive in Hartley Library of local officials writing to Wellington saying, look, can you approve X, Y, and Z so that we can carry out our basic functions of governance? they're asking for him to sort of sign off on things like tax returns and stuff like that because they can't reach their true higher authority, which is, of course, Paris and the prefect system and all the rest of it. Instead, they're turning to the enemy who's occupying the region, going, "Yeah, you're the person in charge here. Can you sign off?" So it's interesting to hear that that's a problem in the duchy as much as it is
Yeah,
in France.
but in southern France, the situation was quite simple. That we've got this English troops or coalition troops, and France, which was, of course, enemy of the France, right? But in the Polish case, we've got this whole political issue that who is in charge here, in fact, because Tsar, of course, had his own purposes. Prussia had their own one. Of course, Poles had their own one, and there is there were many players in that game, in fact. So the situation was very hard.
Yeah, it was a dangerous time for the duchy for sure, and just see what happens come the Congress of Vienna. It doesn't end well. I
Yeah,
want to talk about Napoleon for a bit, if we may, and we sort of teased people about this before because you really surprised me with something that you said, and I'm not going to spoil it, but it's all tied up in this idea about loyalty to Napoleon and where a line existed. And I won't say any more than that and let you tell us the rest.
yeah, because the Poles are seen as the ones who were clearly on Napoleon's side in the Napoleonic Wars. Of course, there is a lot of truth in that, and as I said in the last episode, the Poles were by Napoleon's side from the time of the first Italian campaign to the Battle of Waterloo. And yes, I stand by what I said in the last episode that the Poles were Napoleon's most loyal allies. But the issue is not as clear cut as it seems. An entirely separate issue is how the alliance with Napoleon was perceived by politicians. So let me present how it looked from a purely military perspective. Let's start with the fact that many Legion soldiers were very disappointed after the Peace of Luneville, which didn't address the Polish question. Then came the sending of Polish soldiers to San Domingo, of course, when, as I mentioned in the previous episode, most of them just died. This rather particular state of mind can be seen if we, for example, analyze the poetry of Cyprian Kodebski, where on the one hand we can see the apotheosis of the legions, but on the other hand, a deep disappointment with France. And the situation changed with the entry of the Grand Army on Polish soil, and even those disappointed people returned to duty, but kept some distance from Napoleon. In one report to Dąbrowski, the officer writing it noted, not without reason, that young volunteers had much better morale than veterans. The same distance applied to the aristocracy. Therefore, Poniatowski wanted Napoleon to give political guarantees first. In the end, he gave up these demands because he wanted to have a decisive influence on the Polish army. So these were purely personal factor. The Peace of Tilsit was another very disappointed for Poles. It was so great that a ban was issued on officers chanting anti-Napoleonic slogans loudly in taverns. However, it was soon realized that the situation after Tilsit was temporary and the mood improved. The rise of anti-Napoleonic attitudes was also influenced by the war in Spain. I mentioned that many officers fighting there were resigning. One of these was the command of the 4th Infantry Regiment, Count Potocki. What he saw in Spain led to a change in his attitude. Before the war, he had been a Napoleon supporter. After his resignation, he became its opponent. And this led to his participation in a conspiracy organized by Friedrich von Pilsach. Have you heard of this conspiracy?
Sorry, just remind me of the name again.
Friedrich von Pilsach. He
It's
was
not one
Saxon.
that springs to mind. That may just be ignorance on my part. Enlighten us.
Saint von Pilzach was the Saxon ambassador in Paris and later foreign officer of foreign minister, of Saxony. At the end of 1809, together with Potocki, he devised a plan to provoke an anti-Napoleonic uprising in which Polish soldiers and Germans were to take part, as Pilzach was in contact with secret societies like Tugendbund, for example. In time, contacts were established with the Tsar, as evidenced by the negotiations made by Prince Adam Jerzy Czartoryski, conducted with, among others, with Poniatowski. The uprising was to be part of the Russian attack on the Duchy in 1811. The outbreak didn't take place because Potocki unexpectedly died in February 1811 and Poniatowski refused to cooperate. Besides, with war with Russia looming, the conspiracy just collapsed. But it was certainly known to many senior officers, even seemingly as pro-Napoleonic as Dąbrowski, who, although he had a bust of Napoleon in his palace at Vinogura, was disappointed with his position in the Duchess army, which he felt was inadequate to his influence. Another very interesting example of an anti-Napoleonic attitude is the case of Captain Vincente Dłuski. Dłuski was a veteran of the Spanish War in the ranks of the Vistula Legion. He resigned and joined the army of the Duchy when he acted as an instructor. In 1811, he decided to desert and flee to Russia. There are theories about that this was a provocation made by Polish intelligence, but in my opinion, this is not true. After deserting to the Russian side, Dłuski wrote a memorandum where he described the reasons for his escape and generally characterized the duchy and the attitude of its citizens. He believed that the Napoleonic style system didn't suit the Napoleonic spirit of the Poles and Polish traditions. He also described the generalship. For example, he called Poniatowski a good lord, popular in the army, but on the other hand, Dłuski called him a weak commander and believed that he was unable to escape French influence. Further two situations from 1813 can be described. Immediately after the Russian campaign negotiations took place between the Polish government and the Tsar with a view to the Poles crossing over to the other side at the price of retaining some form of statehood. It can be said that, in fact, those negotiations didn't end successfully for two reasons. Firstly, the lack of clear declarations from Alexander, who didn't want to give them, especially after the Treaty of Kalisz and thus Prussians crossing over to his side. And secondly, Poniatowski's strong opposition. Poniatowski was, in fact, the most important Pole in 1813, both in political and military matters, and therefore, in my opinion, his character should be considered not only as a military man, but also as a statesman. During one of his conversations with Edouard Bignon, who was a French ambassador, Prince Poniatowski told a very important phrase, I quote, "I salute the greatness and power of the emperor, but if he were to demand of me a step contrary to the saving of my homeland, I couldn't obey him." So it's a quite cruel situation, right? Finally, Poniatowski believed that despite his defeat in Russia, Napoleon was still the best option for the Poles, although making the final decision didn't come easily to him. There is a very known scene from Krakow when one morning one of Poniatowski's friends entered his room and he saw two loaded pistols on the table. Asked what was the matter, Poniatowski replied that he had been thinking all night whether to shoot himself or not. So it was quite hard decision for him, in fact. And the second situation of 1813 took place after the Battle of Leipzig, when the morale of the Poles had reached rock bottom, in fact. As I mentioned before, after Poniatowski's death, Prince Żukowski was commander-in-chief, which happened, as I said, as a result of a conspiracy. And of course, Żukowski, as I said, has the opinion that okay, we are going to run and we will come back. But the situation was changed in the end of October 1813 when we see another great example of great talents of Napoleon and his oral skills, because he was moving. He was moving and he just met Polish soldiers and he decided, okay, let's have a meeting with the Polish officers. And he ordered all Polish officers to came to him, and he just had a speech. We've got few versions of that speech. We've got in fact same cases. In the most of them, he said that yes, I made many mistakes in the Polish question, especially in 1812. I know that I made these mistakes, but I know that I'm 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 you're the best option anyway, because nobody can give you more than me. If you go to France, I give you everything you want. You will be you will get your rewards. I will give you supplies, give you pay you want, and if I lose, I will cover your safe retreat to Poland. And in fact, he did it, right? Because we got this article from the Duchy of Warsaw when it's written that the Polish army must came back to Poland freely, right? So this was this situation from the state of mind. I don't want to do anything from to be from Pereira, right? So that's why this is not so easy thing.
But what I love about that is that I mean, I can't pretend that I've read a vast amount on this topic, but it's always felt to me as if the 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 troops of the Duchy of Warsaw and the inhabitants of the region have been sort of treated as if they're passive in this process. You know, that they're either manipulated or they're hoodwinked into supporting Napoleon, or they're so desperate to try and achieve nationhood that they end up just doing what Napoleon tells them. That's certainly the impression that I've got. What you've done there is just give us a brilliant indication of no, these people are active participants because they're human. And so you get the whole range of human opinion and emotion thrown into the mix of this question. I absolutely loved that.
Yeah,
Thank you for
yeah,
that.
yeah. The thing is that we've got this quotation of Churchill, which said that Polish have everything, but no political character. You know, this political ability to be real politicians, right? But I think that it's in Napoleonic period, it's not true. Both had their minds and they knew their situation, which was quite hard. You know, it's in general, both had this situation that we are blessed and condemned because of our geopolitical situation, right? And the Napoleonic era wasn't any exception of it.
No, absolutely. You are sandwiched slap bang in the middle of Europe. And
Between Germans and Russians. So
yeah, exactly. I want to ask actually about how Napoleon is remembered within Poland, because on one level, you can very easily spin a a narrative of Napoleon, sort of almost a national hero for the Poles. He gives them their nation back, albeit briefly. But then, of course, everything goes wrong. And where does the blame for that lie? Well, I would personally argue that the blame for that lies with Napoleon. So, in one sense, it's perhaps his fault that he doesn't manage to preserve what he's created for the Poles. The Poles absolutely do their bit to contribute to the cause and yet kind of get left down. So, talk us through this.
in fact, the discussion about Napoleon and his role in Polish history continues in Poland to this day, albeit mainly among historians and people interested in the era, as the Napoleonic era doesn't play a large role in historical consciousness in Poland, actually. Of course, there is mention of Napoleon in schools during history lessons in Poland, but there is a lack of content dedicated to him in pop culture and on the internet, which would reach a wide audience. I have the opportunity to work in a grant dealing with historical content on the Polish language internet. And in 2019, my colleagues and I did a big analysis covering the 6 most popular YouTube channels on historical topics with over 600 videos. And the entire 19th century only accounts for less than 5% of views and less than 3% of videos. So it's total margin, in fact. Also, if we look at Facebook, here there are Napoleonic themed pages, of course, but their reach is not great. For example, the most popular one currently has about 20K likes, while one of the most top pages about World War II currently has twice of it, easily. And the same applies to films. I think we both looking forward to the Ridley Scott film and recently has announced Steven Spielberg miniseries. Perhaps they will make a difference. From my observations, the more there is about a particular era in culture and on the internet, the more willing people are to take an interest in it, which would actually be very useful for us because there are probably fewer historians dealing with the period in Poland than there used to be, and there are still quite a lot of research opportunities. But coming back to the main thread, a rather interesting phenomenon is the growing popularity in Poland recently of the so-called Black Legend of Napoleon. About 2 or 3 years ago, there was quite an echo among my friends of an article that stated that war crimes during the Napoleonic Wars were basically committed only by the French and their allies, which is, of course, untrue. But it does show a trend. Interestingly, most of these articles are written by journalists, and it seems that to me that they have a rather pale understanding of the era and and the titles are typical clickbaits, although there are also exceptions to this. In the previous episode, I mentioned that I have a rather critical attitude towards Adam Zamoyski, so perhaps I will extend on this a bit. Namely, I think that Zamoyski's approach to Napoleon is very biased, which sometimes led to quite peculiar situations. For example, in one of the interviews, he said that there should not be a monument to Napoleon in Warsaw, but a monument to Tsar Alexander should be erected. And in my opinion, it's an absurd sentence. Nevertheless, Zamoyski, as a popular and recognized author, is firmly establishing a narrative that portrays Napoleon negatively. And this anti-Napoleonic trend was definitely helped by the anniversary of the Napoleon's death in 2021. More began to be written about Napoleon, and many historical and journalistic judgments emerged. And with phenomena such as echo chambers and tribalization resulting in a zero-sum perception of historical figures, it was only a step to a rush of online experts in inverted commas, in fact. Of course, there is not to say that Napoleon is viewed negatively in Poland. I think that a neutral approach commonly prevails because of the aforementioned lack of greater knowledge, but there are also a few initiatives and people who care about popularizing the era. For more than 20 years, there is a portal, napoleon.org.pl, which has also its own Facebook page, a very interesting one. Another interesting initiative is a fan page, Napoleon Inaczej, Napoleon on the different side, which is run by my friend Agnieszka Fulinska, which by the way is a great expert in Napoleon II. He had a great collection of things connected to him, and she is her fan page is very interesting. Plus, there is a Fleming historical reenactment movement. The Napoleonic era is one of the most popular subjects when it comes to reenactment. I would like, of course, to take this opportunity to say hello to my fellow reenactors, as some of them are probably listening to our conversation. In conclusion, the topic is complex. I am curious to see what the reaction in Poland will be after the release of Scott's film.
Yes, there's a thing that will no doubt be discussed at length on this podcast. What is no longer called Kit Bag because nobody really understood the title, but is simply being called Napoleon, the Ridley Scott film that everyone's been talking about, will no doubt be the focus of an episode at some point, as I imagine will the Steven Spielberg 7-part series that's been announced with HBO, assuming that this podcast lasts long enough for that to see the light of day and for us to comment on it. It is very interesting to hear how different nations remember Napoleon. And yes, the echo chamber thing on social media is a massive problem, right? There have been plenty of Facebook groups that I've been in where, and my views on Napoleon are well known, right? So, and I take a lot of stick for that in certain forums, and well, fine, it's history. We've all got different opinions, but it does get very sort of simplistic, shall we say, in its assessment. The fact that I'm British automatically means that I cannot think for myself, and I've therefore swallowed Napoleonic propaganda, and in no way am capable of any kind of independent historical analysis. That's the kind of stuff that gets leveled at you if you start to critique Napoleon. And it's interesting regions play a role in this. So in Asia, Napoleon seems to be regarded quite positively. In the US, I would say the view generally leans towards the positive, but it varies inevitably from person to person. But broadly speaking, I'd say the view is positive. Britain, kind of predictable, not a fan. Spain, well, again, not surprisingly, not particularly popular. It'll be interesting to see how Napoleon's being spun in Russia right now. Because
that could be a very drastic issue.
Yes, it could be.
If we analyze the reaction of the Russians after the Napoleonic Wars, this whole young officers movement, the cabrists movement and things like that.
Indeed. I'm going to go off on a bit of a tangent here, but we've talked pretty much exclusively about the men who obviously were important to the story. However, there is one woman who was also very obviously important in the context of championing the cause of Polish independence with Napoleon. That was Marie Walewska. Did I get the pronunciation right on the name there?
Yeah, you did it well.
Okay, well, thank you very much. We'll consider that to be progress, and I will hold that up in vindication the next time I screw something up royally. Just give us a brief sense of her place within the history of Poland during this period. When we were I was on another show and we were championing the best people from Polish history. I very deliberately went for Marie Walewska because I find her fascinating, but also really kind of influential. That role in trying to keep the dream of a Polish nation alive. I didn't win in that debate, but I find her fascinating. I'm interested in the take of somebody who properly knows the history here.
I think I will disappoint you a little bit because I think Walewska's influence on Polish history is overrated.
Oh, boo, hiss. No, we can't. This is an echo chamber podcast. We can't allow difference of opinion. Carry on.
Okay, so let's start at the beginning. Maria Walewska Wączyńska was born in 1796 and came from middle-class nobility. She received an elementary education. Interestingly, her teacher was Mikołaj Chopin, father of the famous composer Fryderyk. In 1804, she married Anastazy Walewski. On the day of the wedding, the bride was 18 and the groom 67. The marriage was probably arranged to avoid a social scandal, as Maria gave birth to a son shortly after the wedding. It was widely supposed that Anastasia wasn't the boy's biological father. The most likely father was a Russian Arkady Suvorov, grandson of the famous Field Marshal Suvorov, which didn't look too good, not only because there was talk of a maiden pregnancy, which was obviously socially frowned upon in the realities of the time, but also because of an affair with a representative of one of the partitioning countries, right? Moving to the main plot, there are several hypotheses about how and when Maria's first meeting with Napoleon took place. Most likely it happened at the ball in Warsaw in early January 1807. Some believe that Napoleon is supposed to have fallen in love with Maria at first sight because of her youth and uncommon beauty. However, the diarist of the time, Anna Potocka, describes the nascent affection somehow differently. I quote, since Napoleon had expressed a wish for some Polish woman to be among his amorous conquests, one was chosen as it should be, that is, pretty but mentally blunt.
Oh, excuse me, a man commenting on a woman and describing her as mentally bland.
No, but
Hmm.
no, it's memoirs written by woman.
Uh, uh, well, that's just plain rude. Okay, sorry. Remind me again of who said this.
Anna Potocka.
Okay,
She
Anna
was
Potocka. What's
married
her?
to one of the Polish generals of the period in that time.
Okay, is there friction between them by any chance? I mean, it doesn't sound like they get on particularly well. Is there a sort of deeper subtext to that? That they do they butt heads at various points in time?
To be honest, I don't know, but I think that these memoirs are quite good. So I think she had right in some way. I think more or less.
Okay, apologies, I interrupted you. You carry on whilst I sit here and
Yeah,
sort of
yeah, no problem. So
to
let's
myself.
us now turn to Valeska's political role. Before her death, she wrote down her memoirs, in which she recalls the contents of a letter whose authors were supposed to be members of the Polish government, in which we can read, among other things, I quote, "As a woman, you can serve her, the homeland, with your own body," end quote. In turn, Prince Poniatowski was to write, I quote, "The whole of Poland demands this," Romance with Napoleon, "for Poland from you. It appeals to your patriotism." But to this day, the veracity of those quotations hasn't been completely confirmed. Historians often accuse Walewska of wanting to whitewash herself and save her good name. However, it's likely that she was subjected to various types of pressure and manipulation in a more or less blunt manner. Her acquaintance with Napoleon was presented to her not as a mere love affair, but a matter of political importance. Of course, we aren't sure how things really were. The version, the version of events she put forward years later, where she actually talks about the more political dimension of her relationship with Napoleon, is not at all unusual. After all, perhaps Maria was impressed by Bonaparte. Perhaps she was an escape for her husband, which was of course quite old. Perhaps she actually believed that she was sacrificing herself for the good of the homeland. Certainly, Walewska felt strongly about Napoleon, as evidenced by her visit to Elba in 1814, which was quickly left, however, because Napoleon was still hoping Marie-Louise would join him. I think that Walewska's only real influence on history is related to her fruit of her love affair with Napoleon, which was Alexander Walewski, born in 1810. For Napoleon, it was the ultimate confirmation that he wasn't infertile, leading to his divorce with Josephine and marriage to the aforementioned Marie-Louise. Interestingly, Alexander was French Minister of the Foreign Affairs during the reign of his, in fact, cousin Napoleon III. Also, if you were to look at a photograph of Walewski, you would notice a great resemblance to Napoleon. I'm quite sure that if such a, I don't know, Metternich, for example, had the opportunity to see him during some negotiations, he would think, like, I don't know, this man with CJ from GTA San Andreas, oh, here we go again. Unfortunately for Franz, Walewski didn't inherit his father's military skills. There is an anecdote related to this from the time of the November uprising, but that's a topic for another conversation, I think. Coming back to Maria, her marriage was annullated in 1812. As I mentioned, she still saw Napoleon on Elba and later in 1815 in Malmaison Palace. She later married Philippe d'Ornano in 1816. However, she died just 1 year later as a result of kidney problems.
Well, that's given me plenty of food for thought. I think I need to go away and do some more reading, but thank you for that. It's always nice when somebody turns around to you and says, I'm not sure I agree with you, because sometimes people are inclined to just sort of go, okay, I'll humor you. Clearly you're an idiot, Zach. So thank you for that. That's given me a lot to ponder on there. I'm gonna end this by bringing it back to the men and just talk about what we do and we don't know about them post-war. There's always that temptation to just go, okay, the fighting stops, now we stop caring. Is it possible to trace what happens to any of them once the conflict is over?
Yeah, we can identify two main variants of fate, although this mainly concerns officers because, again, lack of sources. The first variant was further military service because in 1815 the Congress of Vienna established the Kingdom of Poland with Tsar Alexander as its ruler, and his brother Grand Duke Constantine became the commander-in-chief. He quite quickly began to introduce in the army a strict discipline modeled on the Russian one, which didn't please very many officers. Constantine was also a very conflicted individual, and it was an extra aspect why many officers left the service within the next 1 to 4 years, in fact. It's worth noting here that although many officers and soldiers didn't accept the new political order, they've remained in the army because of their material situation. After so many years of wars, military service was simply a stable source of income for them, especially if they could count if they could count on nothing else, right? The second group were especially officers who didn't remain in the army. Most of them resigned. Less often, they weren't accepted by the verification commission responsible for the formation of the new army. Most often, they settled in their estates. This was particularly true of those who had their estates outside of borders of the post-1815 Kingdom of Poland, such as Dąbrowski and Sulkowski. And interestingly, many of these officers later returned to military service during the November uprising of 1830, which created a number of problems, but it is also a topic for quite another story.
David, this has been an absolute tour de force. I mean, this was a requested episode, folks. Bear in mind, it was meant to be like 160 to 90-minute show. If, by the way, you want to request episodes, Patreon is your friend. There's a whole tier dedicated to that. Go have a look at it if it tickles your fancy. But talk about value for inverted commas money. 2 episodes amounting to nearly 3 hours of content on a fascinating topic. I don't know how you've managed to keep it kind of light and entertaining the whole way through. Thank you so much for your time. I know that you have a book forthcoming in that you've got to finish the PhD and then you're going to turn it into a book, and hopefully
I hope it will be released next year. So I think we will have an occasion to have another podcast maybe.
hey, absolutely. I am completely up for that. In the meantime, folks, you're going to want to go and follow David on Twitter. Remind us of the Twitter handle.
Yeah, it's .dawjra93.
There you go, folks. As ever, look at the descriptor to the episode. I will put the Twitter handle down there. And also bear in mind, folks, if you want to sit in on these episodes, as one of my Patreon supporters has, again, go to Patreon, find out more about how you can sit in on the show and then also ask your questions. But David, thank you so much for your time. Best of luck with the, well, no, why am I wishing you luck with the PhD? You quite clearly don't need luck on the PhD. You're going to blitz it. I look forward to seeing you again as Dr. Gralik in the not too distant future. Stay in touch, my friend.
Thank you very much. Dziękuję.
Dziękuję. Folks, if you've enjoyed this show, please do me a favor. Head over to Apple Podcasts or Spotify and leave a 5-star review. If you're not a regular listener, remember to hit that subscribe button so you can find your way back. All of those things are incredibly powerful in helping this show to reach a wider audience. Much love, as ever, to all my Patreon supporters. Shout outs to my mentioned in Dispatches patrons Rob Griffith, Brendan Teeling, Beatrice de Graaf, Lynn Dawson, Jamie Kingston, Lucy Tatner, Jim Deary, Josh Keeney, Colin Fieldhouse, Stephen Coulson, Jim Getz, Stephen Gillen, Hugh Brennan, Alistair Campbell-Grieve, Andy Meakin, Mark Anscombe, Rob Coughlin, Bruins Girl, Noah Fink, Mark Trowbridge, Miles Reedy, Nick Overland, Graham Goodwin, Chris Pramas, Anthony Gumbau, Anonymous American, Martin Pisani, James Fluick, Natasha Hobday, Rod Schwager, Chris Kimball, Gary Dennis, David Gralik, Ted Andrews, David Milinski, Richard Anderson, Arthur Forgy, Sam Moore, Wyatt Pollock, Carol Dixon-Smith, Roland Shark, Giovanni, Jean-Baptiste Merlon, and Darla Vincent. And the Admirals, John Haynes, Ryan Diamond, JC Kaiser, Bob Burnham, Mike Guest, Liam Telfer, Todd and Ned Campbell, Rachel Stark, Mark Duckers, David Maxwell, David Priest, Graham Callister, Sean Sullivan, Stephen Ashworth, Dan Hazelwood, Kate Walcombe, Clemens Beman, Charles McKay, Reto the Sci-Fi Fan, Tim Day, Mark Chestnut, and Jason Morn. I'll be back very soon, but until then, I'm Zack White. This has been the Napoleonic Wars Pod. Take care of yourselves, my friends. Stay well, stay safe, and as always, thank you for listening.